Have you ever wondered how old the stories of Ireland's mythology are? Well, Dag Eve August Fáilte. Hi, hello, and welcome. Jon O'Sullivan from the Irish Pagan School. And I have had exactly that wondering in my time and had to go and find out for myself. And it led me down quite the rabbit hole of exploration because it wasn't just a case of how old the stories were themselves, it was also how they were documented, the age of how they were documented, and then the history of what was going on at the time that these stories were written down. So when I talk about the stories of Ireland, they're kind of academically separated into a number of categories. There's four great categories. There's the mythological cycle, the Ulster cycle, the Fenian cycle, also known as the Oceanic cycle, and then there's the cycle of kings. So those are the four kind of main categories in which academically we explore these stories or these tales. But it doesn't kind of, it's not just one selection of one manuscript where all of this is written down. It's multiple manuscripts. It's multiple manuscripts from the medieval period of Ireland's past. Now, when I say medieval, it covers a long kind of era and of time frame and history as we look at it. Some of the more famous ones to look at is, of course, the Book of Leinster, the Book of Moy, the Great and the Yellow Book of Lecan, which are two different books, both of which have variations of similar tales in it. If it wasn't for, I think it's the Great Book of Lecan, we wouldn't have the Táin Bó Cúailnge as we know, because one of the most comprehensive recensions of the Táin Bó Cúailnge, which is the central saga story of the Ulster cycle involving the bulls, the white bull, the brown bull, Queen Maeve, Cuchulainn. If it wasn't for that document, if it wasn't for that medieval manuscript, we would not have those tales. We wouldn't have pretty much the Ulster cycle as we know it in our history and our mythology. So hopefully it's given you a bit of an insight into like the importance of these documents. But the documents themselves, because they're written in these medieval manuscripts, it's laboriously illuminated sheaves of vellum with like old school iron ink and those beautiful kind of images that you are familiar with whenever you look up Irish art or Celtic art or medieval like swirls and spirals, etc. A lot of that comes from those illuminated manuscripts. If it wasn't for their existence, we wouldn't have our stories in our physical sense, and that is because of the occupation and colonization of the country. Now, the oldest manuscript that we can date, because it's a physical thing, we can physically, scientifically date it, is a book called the Book of the Dun Cow. And so we can date the book itself and the creation of the book to a period of 1006 Common Era. So that's over a thousand, we're what, 20? Yeah, it's over 1,020 years old, almost. It's coming up on 1,020 years old at the time of the recording this video, and which is amazing and fascinating. And we still have this manuscript. So the manuscript itself is these illuminated works done by medieval monks documenting down these stories that are presented to them. But within the Book of the Dun Cow itself, when we look at it linguistically, we find something different. Now we know that as these manuscripts began to age and fade over time, they were copied, they were maintained, which is why we end up with variations upon variations of stories and different recensions of these tales, because the manuscripts themselves were copied and recopied when they began to fade. So we look at the Book of the Dun Cow, we can date it to 1,000 Common Era, 1,006 Common Era, but linguistically, when we look at the structure of the Irish language that is written in that manuscript, we can date that back further. We can date that back to the 8th or ninth 900 Common Era. So the 8th or ninth century. So the idea that we have these stories from all that time ago still available to us, even after the colonization, even after the destruction of the Irish culture and that Irish language by the various colonizations that happened most recently by England. Because I include Christianity as a colonizing force in that circumstance. We had the Normans. The Vikings didn't exactly colonize, they kind of integrated to a certain degree. Some of the Normans integrated as well, which is why, oddly and interestingly, these medieval manuscripts have been taken out of Ireland and preserved by Norman families out of Ireland in France or in England itself because they saw the value of these documents. And over time, the Irish people have managed to get them back. I think most recently the Book of Fermoy has been regifted back to the Irish people, which is another resource for all of these ancient manuscripts and ancient stories. So the age of the stories is mind-boggling. The fact that we're able to look at our narrative history. Because as okay, when we look at the Cycle of Kings, for example, there's large lists, glossaries, annals, which are taken from these books, which talk about historical figures. These kings in Ireland, when they ruled, who they were, what was their key feature, were they hospitable, were they warlike, were they whatever. So this is predominantly the Cycle of Kings. One thing I love about Cycle of Kings, those and maybe these long lists, but in the margins in between, there's these little kind of comments or these side comments known as marginalia, which talk about like kind of scathing remarks or like, opinions of them documented after the fact. So it's absolutely fascinating that we have all of this information that is available to us in this context. So we can date the stories back to the 8th and ninth century linguistically, Common Era. But we know that Ireland, before the advent of written script, before the arrival of Christianity, was an oral tradition. The stories themselves, talking about the kings, talking about all of these great heroes, champions, etc., in all of their eras, include a cast of people known as filla or bards. And the function of a filla of a bard was to remember the stories and to provide those stories, to perform those stories, and to involve people in the narratives. And the stories weren't just, well, once upon a time, like, there was three bears in a wood. These stories were, remember the naming of this landscape, remember the naming of these heroes, remember those who fought and died in those locations. You know, all of these stories were less about, well, entertainment and value. They were more, very much more about who are we as a people? Where do we come from? What is our situation on the land in which we live? Who are we descended from? How do we act out of honor and honesty? How do we act out of integrity? Or how do our stories warn us and tell us what happens to people who break trust with the spirituality, with the sovereignty of the island in many ways as well? So I absolutely love all of these stories. I'm going to leave you with a small little excerpt here. There's an excerpt that comes from like the volume of stories. Like we have an idea of the age of the stories, but there's one thing I came across, and we have a story of a guy called Forgal. Forgal, it was an old Irish fella, and he is said to have gone and settled within the hall of the king Mongan MacFéachna. Now, Mongan MacFéachna is someone that we can look up as a kind of his mythological and historical figure. So it connects Forgal with going, and the presence and the position of Fila was that they could travel around, but it was talking for your supper, it was performing for your meals and for your stay. What's great about Forgal is that he was under obligation to provide a new and different story every single night. So every night when they would sit down, he would be called to do a performance. And he stayed from Samhain right the way through to Bealtaine with a new story every night. He went from October all the way through to May. He went for, if we take it as 6 months, 30 days, he went for 180 days with a new story every night. And these aren't stories written down. He didn't have books to refer to. He didn't have like manuscripts to check over. He had the stories remembered in his brain. So this is really the core value of Fila, the core memory, the structure of those stories as they're provided. So when we get to these written down manuscripts, they're written down by these people, written down by people who are hearing those stories when people have been trained to remember, people who have been like brought forward to make sure that they can relay those stories generation after generation to make sure that we remember who we are. So I don't think such a feat could currently be done in our world. I work really, really hard myself to make sure I have stories in my brain, not just because I want to know all of the stories for my own self. It's because some part of me wants to have the memory of those, to honor those traditions of the ancient Irish bards and villas who could be called upon with the answer with a kecht, which is the Irish word for question, and they would start all of their responses with ni answer, not hard to say, and provide them the story which gave their answer. So stories have always been central to Irish culture. If it wasn't for the passion and the connection that we have always had with story, We wouldn't have any of these medieval manuscripts to look back at, to document, and to learn from. And that's why I think it's really, really important to not just understand the tales or the narratives, to do get into the timeline of where these manuscripts come from. What was the history at the time? What was Ireland like when these stories were being documented? What happened to these manuscripts themselves as they were taken from Ireland when we were conquered and colonized? And how crucially and importantly do we need to have them back? Do we need to be able to see what other stories are actually out there from our culture, from our native culture before everything else that happened to Ireland? So I did a class on this. It is the story cycles of of the Irish lore, really. It's available at the Irish Pagan School. I'll pop a link in the bottom if you want to really deep dive into not just the structure of the manuscripts, like some of the main manuscripts, the date, the time, who wrote them, where they came from, but then also the timelines, this historical impact, what was happening in Ireland when these manuscripts were being taken down and created or being taken out of Ireland and away. So if you're interested, please do. I invite you to check out the link. Look after yourself until next time. Slán. Goodbye.